Welcome to the Dance Centre podcast. I am your host, Claire French, and I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, also known as Vancouver, Canada. I'll be talking to dancers, choreographers and other members of the dance world here on the West Coast to find out more about their creative work and practices and to discuss what it means to us to be dance professionals today. Thanks for joining us. Nellie Gossen is an interdisciplinary artist based on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Working through the media, fashion, costume, textiles and performance, Nellie uses clothing as a tool to think and feel through social systems. With an interest in repurposing the materials, rhythms and performances of the mainstream fashion industry, Nellie practices fashion as a space of study, ceremony, and as a critical lens through which to research embodied experiences of consumer capitalism. Drawing on formal training in both fashion design and religious studies, Nellie is particularly interested in the space that's created when clothing and contemplative practices meet. Nellie has presented her work at Kunsthalle am Hamburgerplatz, Berlin, Basket, Berlin, Altes Finanzamt, Berlin, and Kudam Kari, Berlin. For the full schedule of the viewing dates and times for returns, please visit the Dance Centre's website at thedancecentre.ca and find the event Nellie Gossen Returns, and all of the dates and times will be listed there. Nellie, thank you for joining me straight from the studio. You've had a few days in the studio now, which we'll hear all about with you, but yeah, I really do appreciate you jumping into this after your full days. And so I wonder if we could start with that for you to kind of say hello to everybody and maybe just talk a little bit about what your day was like in the studio today. Maybe we could start.
Sure, absolutely. I would love to. And thank you so much for having me here. And that's a great first question. That's really meeting me where I'm at. So I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So today I think this is our 5th day as a group in our studio practice. We have been doing some shopping work before that. And really this is as landing as a performance team with all of the collaborators that are going to be with us for our January performance. So a beautiful kind of coming together. Yeah, today we actually had a really fantastic day of running our full run so far. And yeah, I think it was a really kind of invigorating, feel-good day for everybody. So it's a perfect moment for me to be joining you and talking about this work here. Yeah.
Exactly. You can reflect on, because you're in a good place, you can kind of positively reflect on what's happening.
Exactly.
But I'd love to know a little bit about what you particularly mean by shopping work, because, after my own heart, to put those two things together is just, exquisite. But maybe this could be a little bit of insight into how you have brought materials into the studio, not to give too much away at this point in terms of what because obviously things may change. But so choosing the fabrics and going to, or textiles, or the materials that you will be using in the studio, is that something all of you have done as collaborators? And was there a concept behind that in the search, or does the concept kind of emerge with the choice of materials?
Yeah, well, maybe what I can do just to start out with is I can share a little bit, or the kind of bare bones concept of the project, just to give.
Yeah, I'd love to. This is a perfect opportunity.
Awesome. Yeah.
For you to kind of, in your own words, verbally share with the listeners. Fantastic.
Beautiful. So the show that we're working on returns. It is an ongoing project that is conducted in 30-day iterations. So essentially each iteration follows the same basic concept, which is that we go shopping at mass chain stores that have 30-day retail return policies. And this 30-day retail return policy then becomes the framework of our inquiry. So we buy a whole bunch of clothing of all different kinds. We bring it back to our performance space, so back to the dance center, and we then very, very carefully take everything apart. We disassemble all of the pieces that we have worked with. And then over the course of the 30 days, we essentially use these materials as the kind of building blocks, as materials for new kind of sculptural material inquiries, making new garment constellations, new sculptural forms, and then also using these materials in relationship to our bodies and conducting movement scores throughout the whole process. So really feeling into the embodied experience of these materials. Then at the end of that period, we take everything that we have done apart again, we very carefully reassemble everything back into its original condition. We are kind of using these systems to borrow these materials, these rhythms, these choreographies from mainstream retail consumer systems, and then kind of creating new things, asking new questions within that, and then returning them back to the system. My training is in fashion design. My professional training is in making clothing and clothing construction. So really, we are relying on skills, on hard skills of what it means to put clothing back together, to assemble clothing. And this has been a long-term process of kind of trial and error, of figuring out what pieces of clothing lend themselves well to being taken apart and put back together again, what stores have the right kind of quality that we're aiming for to have that happen. So, it's been a long process.
So you've already talked about recognizing the fabrics and the way that the clothes are made, constructed as choreographies, which I really appreciate. And so when you are in a studio and you're working with them, you've mentioned them as sculptures and body sculptures in a way. What is the relationship to dance or to movement? Could you talk a little bit about that, and maybe what your interest is in movement and dance, and what your experience is maybe with dance too?
Absolutely. What I can say is that, I mentioned before, my background, my primary training is in fashion design.
Yeah.
And my kind of interest, or how I understand fashion practice, is it's a practice of the body. I understand clothing practice as a practice of the body. My practice is inherently interdisciplinary, and I'm really have for a very long time been in conversation, this kind of dialogue between clothing practice and performance practice. So kind of incorporating the moving body and the thinking body and the feeling body have really been central elements to how I think about clothing practice, and what actually is interesting for me about thinking about fashion and kind of troubling mainstream fashion practices to really center the experience of the body. So in that sense, movement work, embodied work is really a large part of my work. In terms of dance, I'm not a professional dancer. I am a dancer just for fun because I'm in a body and I like to move.
Excellent.
But I've had the privilege of collaborating with many dance artists and learning from many dance artists, and using that really as a way into thinking about clothing and the body. And when I'm thinking about dance practice and choreographic practice, we're really talking about expanded choreography. So rather than a more kind of traditional dance context, it's really pulling everyday choreographies, pulling gestures and movements and experiences from these everyday systems, and how we can fully be present to those. So that's really what I'm interested in.
Yeah. Is there a kind of would you say there's a kind of minimal aesthetic for the kind of movement that you end up exploring with the materials, or is that too limiting does it depend?
I think it depends. I mean, so what we're really focused on in this particular process is the embodied experience of shopping. That's definitely a part of that. The embodied experience of working, of labor, and exactly what textile labor is, the history, lineages of textile labor, current experiences of textile labor. So how we can use our bodies to attune to realities of textile labor. That's a big one. And then just day-to-day practices of dressing ourselves, dressing others, dressing objects. So yeah, they're everyday. They're very much familiar, kind of everyday choreographic scores. Yeah.
Yeah. And somewhat subversive at the same time as being quite overt. I would have thought. It's fascinating, really interesting. So is it important for you to work with people who have an interest in fashion, or also have a penchant for maybe how things feel on the body, or how things are constructed, or even people who are interested in construction? Like, is that something you look for? Is that something you talk about as a team?
Definitely. I mean, so what I consider as fashion is maybe different than how that might be described by other people, or how other people what other people might identify as fashion or not fashion. So I'm really interested in the full spectrum of clothing practices as these kind of materials that we move through the world with. So that very much is a fashion practice to me. My current team of collaborators, I'm working with Erika Mitsuhashi, who has a background in dance. I'm working with Jaewoo Kang, who has a background in film and more recently has been making amazing fashion and costume projects. And then Tone Poro, who is joining us from Berlin and works with craft and material and performance and community organizing. So the current performance team, collaborator team, everybody we all bring different skills and different experience, but each of us does have experience at the intersection of performance and materials at the very least.
Yeah.
All of us have experience sewing, which is really beautiful. So yeah, maybe to answer your question, the folks in this particular iteration, we all think about clothing and how we do talk about our complex and nuanced experiences of clothing and what we like and what we don't like and what our relationship to fashion is. And really importantly, we all also talk about what our relationship to textile labor is, and that particular kind of experience of sewing and what that means for us.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And so you say this is maybe the eighth iteration, seventh or eighth iteration.
Yeah.
Have the other ones been in Germany, in Berlin particularly? Is that, maybe a little bit of the response or the sense of, in a nutshell, in a way, like, how have you, well, not really expanded upon them, but is there anything you'd like to say about your experience of doing those, either the environment that you've actually created them in, or your audiences, or anything that comes to mind about those other iterations that either are with you as you go into a new one, or you find changes with each iteration, like however you want to address that. But I think that's interesting for listeners.
Well, my original first few iterations of this work were for my fashion design graduation project. So the seed was planted in that context a number of years ago. This work started out, I did, maybe like the first 4 iterations in Germany, and then I have done the rest here. And since coming back to Vancouver, I have more actively been working with movement and performance collaborators. So that was really been a big shift or turning point in that process. Previously, I was just doing this process by myself. So it was just me kind of inhabiting and exploring this process. And essentially what I was doing was, taking clothes apart and then dressing myself and making outfits and taking self-timed pictures of myself in different poses and posing and making outfits and posing. And the beautiful thing is all of that is present in the show that we are sharing in January. So all of that, this kind of movement experience of the self-timed photos, that's a part of what we're doing, and how we document ourselves and how we pose and kind of dressing ourselves, that's all incorporated. So little did I know at that time that what I thought I was doing behind closed doors would be the basis of of this actual performance practice. But I think it also speaks to the kind of intimacy of sharing these experiences that are usually done behind closed doors, of dressing ourselves, of sewing. Gosh, like we're navigating a whole industry that is kind of conducting its problematic production practices behind closed doors. So we're really interested in unearthing and sharing these kinds of experiences of labor, experiences of working with our own bodies and experiencing our own bodies in relation to clothing and in dressing ourselves, and these kind of tender everyday experiences, and kind of sharing that as an offering to audiences, to whoever wants to join us.
Yeah, I think there's something, as you just said, it's like the wider industry behind closed doors, but then there's also there's a parallel, isn't there, between like the relationship to like the intimacy of somebody who is sewing with the fabric to the intimacy of the person wearing the clothes. But then there's this like outpouring, because then we're out in the world and people are relating to us through that image. Includes the clothes. We don't walk around naked. Maybe parts of Germany, yes, and a very small part of Vancouver. But that's not, that it's us. It is us. Like it's a layer of us, and at all the stages of its creation. It's also making me think of. I'd love to talk a bit more about Germany, but it's just opened up that whole area for me that I've learned about you and reading some of your work and your bio and everything around end of life care, but also religious studies, and how those things it's all kind of fitting together in terms of this, both an intimacy and then a kind of wider sense of being in the world, or even leaving the world, or even beyond the world. All of those, that I can feel the scale of your interest in that tenderness across all of those things. So maybe we will come back to that, unless you'd like to bring that into talk about this practice now.
Well, something that I'll just piggyback off of something that you were saying in terms of the labor of clothing making, and then how it shapes our being and moving through the world. What I'm really, really interested in is taking these materials seriously, and taking the supply chain, the production of these materials really seriously, taking the labor, the realities of fashion labor really seriously, and recognizing that all of the materials that we're working with are material manifestations of supply chains, of these huge systems that are otherwise hidden from view, that are intentionally hidden from view, that every single item that we are touching has been touched by so many other people. And really understanding these pieces of clothing, these consumer garments, as the material archive of all of these hands, all of this labor that otherwise we actually don't have access to. So really understanding these pieces of clothing as this beautiful, challenging archive of systems that we are involved in, and we move with and against. And then really to think about what that means as we create our identities and use these materials to create our identities, and just really thinking about how many hands, how many other bodies have come into contact with these garments. It's such a beautiful meditation for me, and really challenging, and really requires turning to and witnessing these very, very challenging, very problematic systems. So
yeah, I was just thinking that it's because it's not really about exposing them, as in your choice of like practice. It's more about, there is a sense of it, a kind of being aware of, even if you might not be able to, but there is a traveling, right? There is a passing on, there is a sharing in these materials, which is, yes, so complex. Because if you were to just study the geography of a garment, for example, that would kind of possibly even expose a similar thing, and how far a garment travels, in its process of being made. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting space, and quite weighted then when you start to address just one particular object, as sometimes we, might be something that we do in dance is to use an object or to refer to an object to be inspired or informed by it. And then it, stays in the abstract. The object disappears, and you stay with it. Sometimes they're in kind of improvisation techniques. So there's something this process is calling for that kind of attention. Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm sure that being in Germany also helped that in terms of an approach, maybe even a teaching approach, or maybe even a sense of a kind of holistic. Was that your draw to Germany in the first place, to actually studying fashion design in Germany? Was there a particular draw for you to go there?
I moved to Germany. I first went to Berlin when I was 20. And my interest at that point was not necessarily fashion design, although that has been a thread throughout. Fashion has been a thread throughout my whole life. I think I'm from Vancouver originally. I went to Montreal for a few years in my late teens, was looking to move on. Berlin was the place that everyone was going to. So it was first Berlin for me. Berlin is not known as a fashion capital unless you're interested in club fashion, which then it is. But, I found my way there and found the school that I wanted to study at there. So it kind of came naturally to me. It was kind of a natural path. But of course, my current practice is informed by the particular style of studying in Germany and in Europe, the kind of discourses that I was able to have. I studied fashion design in an art school context, so I was able to have a much more interdisciplinary practice than in a lot of other cases. I was able to study performance art at the same time and really weave in skills and kind of traditions of other disciplines as well. So that absolutely was formative, and really the space where my time in Germany and Berlin was most formative was in learning about performance and practicing performance. In the way that Germany is not necessarily a fashion capital, Berlin is a capital for performance and for dance. And I was able to see so much and be part of so much and be exposed to so much. I worked for many years for a theater there that is one of the kind of main dance and performance venues, and was just able to see everything coming through. So it was a really formative time in terms of understanding how to incorporate, understanding what my interest in performance is and was, and how to incorporate clothing into that.
Yeah, I think that's partly what I meant. I couldn't quite get the words out at the time, but it was the kind of the interdisciplinariness, I think, of the education particularly in Berlin, around art and around art making, but also philosophically. That it seems to me, from the people I know and my experiences of coming up against people who have been trained in Germany in dance, or like me, have PhDs, but have got theirs from Germany in the arts, very open, but also philosophically rooted, like it's a very rigorous training, I think, and a very rigorous approach to education, just in terms of thinking, in terms of like depth of thought, which is what I was referring to, but also the idea of fashion being part of performance, or being part of performance making, or the interdisciplinary nature, and what seems to me to be a kind of freedom of expression with the depth. So I feel like it kind of, what you're talking about has all of those components. Would you mind saying that what the dance venue was in Germany that you were part of?
Yeah, I worked at Hebe am Ufer Theater.
Oh, great.
Yeah, they have three theaters in Berlin, and I worked at the box office for 4 years.
Yeah, so that's great. So what brought you back to Vancouver then?
Well, the pandemic, partially. I finished up my degree there in Berlin, I had been ready to move on for some time, and I had at that point kind of come back to Vancouver for a few longer stretches and had been collaborating with folks here. Yeah, and I was interested in just kind of settling back here and really feeling into what this space was and kind of coming home for a little bit. Yeah.
So, did you study religious studies in Germany, or did you do that? Where was that?
That I finished that degree at UBC.
Did you?
So that was partially at Concordia in Montreal, and then I finished it up at UBC here.
So was that when you were when you moved to Montreal? Did you, or is this a more recent thing? Is that an overlap there? Yeah.
No, that was a degree that I did in my younger late teens, early 20s. But that interest is very much still present. So I did that at a younger moment, and then since coming back to Vancouver, and maybe this is a reason why I did come back to Vancouver, I have been interested in end-of-life care for quite a long time, and spiritual care for quite a long time. So yeah, coming back here has really been a time to gather those. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you imagine that those two worlds for you could kind of come together in a performance context? How do you think you might approach that, or are you already?
I am already. Yes, to have backgrounds in both religious studies and fashion design is not so common, and it has taken me kind of a whole lifetime to figure out how those things come together for me. In terms of a performance context, I think that's harder. I'm feeling into it. I definitely think that working with materials, to really work with touch, to ground ourselves in materials, to ground myself in materials, that there is a lot there, and how we can hold the body in certain contexts. And I'm really interested in how I might work collaboratively with other people in working with folks to make garments together, to travel with them in certain passages. So these are all kind of research questions that I'm working with, but definitely interested in the intersection between clothing and rite of passage work. So yeah, that's more to come, planting the seeds for that.
Yeah, but I can imagine that the process and the materials you would be reading or you would be discovering on that journey would also be like incredible.
Mm-hmm.
And not that you would necessarily, go down any of those paths, but I can imagine, it's almost like it'd be kind of stranger than fiction, almost, the kind of things that you end up like reading about, that and understanding about us, about humanity, and about, being human and the body. Absolutely. To bring us back to that, like
Absolutely.
The things that you find out about the body in those, kind of, it's just remarkable.
Yeah. And these are always practices of embodiment. If we can think about clothing as being a portal to finding our bodies and being in our bodies, then it absolutely comes back to how we think about movement practice and embodied practice. I think there is a lot of crossover in terms of clothing as an entry point, access point to feeling our bodies.
So when an audience is experiencing an iteration, what do they see and what do you hope they get from the experience? Get is the wrong word, but I'm trying not to lead to say another word that puts that word into your mind. Like,
sure. That's okay. So what I can say is, I want to separate the returns, the project that I'm sharing in January, from the religious studies and end of life care stuff, because it is a very different thing, different process. Definitely one that is all about care and caretaking, but in a different way.
Yeah, I think that's good to hear as well, because I think also it's your personal research, it's your personal study.
For sure.
And not everything that every artist studies ends up in the work or ends up being part of what people choose to put into their performance practice. So I think that's really great to say.
Yes,
I think
and
that's
I don't
really
want to
wonderful to premise.
I don't want to scare anyone off by by talking about that if it makes anyone feel uncomfortable.
Or the other way.
Or have
for them to expect
expectations
it, right?
about that. Yeah, that's work for a later date.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for returns, what folks can expect? Well, first of all, it is a more relaxed setting as an audience. So essentially, we are kind of opening our doors for folks to come and join us through this working process and witness what we're doing. We have everything that we're doing through choreographic scores, through movement scores. So very much paying attention to what our bodies are doing in space. And our work is long and slow. That's what folks can expect. It is a durational performance. We are opening our doors to the public for 3 hours a day. We do more or less the same actions throughout, each day. And as the clothing, as the materials change, they necessarily impact and shift what we're doing and how we relate to them. So it is the clothing that actually kind of shapes our performance and shapes what we do as well. But yeah, folks can expect to see us sewing in different configurations and formations around the room, dressing ourselves, dressing each other. Yeah, and doing some sculptural building work that is not necessarily related to our bodies or directly hanging on our bodies. Yeah, so those are kind of the basic forms that we are working with so far. And what would I want folks to take away from it, or to, I guess, what do I want the offering to be is I guess an opening for everybody to feel our bodies, to be mindful of our relationship with clothing. And very much when I'm thinking about clothing here, I'm thinking about how it is this material of a consumer capitalist system, of how we as bodies move through those systems, of how we relate to clothing production. And that's really the space that we are trying to create together, to be able to have that same attunement to fashion systems, to use fashion as a portal to understanding, to witnessing larger movements of consumption and production, or production and consumption of these larger movements of capitalism. And yeah, to really come back to our bodies, to materials, and how we relate to them, how we look at them, how we notice them, how we value them, how we value the labor that went into creating them, and to feel like, to really feel into what that looks like today, what it means for us to be present to that today in each moment.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's a sense of labor being represented in many ways as well, and then our relationship to labor is also part of how we witness, but how we sense what is happening in this work. I would think it maybe even brings us closer to that, and because it will be in a dance space, there is movement, there will be dance, there will be sewing, there will be reconstruction.
Yeah, and what I can say, to that is that actually all parts of our process, they are open to the public. So all of our unpicking is incorporated in our work that we are sharing. All of our re-sewing is incorporated into the work that we're sharing. And the real invitation is for folks to come back as many times as they want. The show is free and people can come and go as they like within those windows of time. So we're really encouraging people to join us at different points if they're interested in doing that, to kind of see the progression, over the course of the month.
That's wonderful. And how do you archive the project then? thinking of the layers of archive that are obviously involved in the project already, and you've talked about those so eloquently. Mm-hmm. Is it important how this is archived for you?
Well, there are two primary ways. We have incorporated taking pictures into our process. So we do use the camera, we do use the kind of camera on a tripod and taking self-timed pictures as part of our scores. Exactly. Yeah.
Back to your original. Yeah.
Yeah, that's nice. Right. Yeah, the selfies. So we have photos of the process, and then the receipt is really kind of the contract that we keep as the end result of our work. Yeah.
Yeah. It's very neat. It's a very neat kind of concept that way. I wonder if audience feedback is at all anything you are interested in having as part of your archiving, or whether that complicates this scenario. I wonder, what kind of response is actually happening from an audience, and whether or not that's just maybe a bit gratuitous to want to know.
Sure.
And maybe it seems a little superfluous to the tight concept you have, but at the same time, I wonder if that would be an interesting material in itself.
Absolutely. I mean, something else I can add is this is the first iteration, the first show that we are doing for a live audience. So we are really so everything up until now has been either research or documented in different ways. So we are in the process of creating that, as we speak. So this is the first time we're really inviting people into this process. And yeah, I absolutely, for that reason, would be curious to hear what folks have to say about it.
Yeah, but first it feels like, like allowing the iterations to keep expanding as they are. The first thing is this live component. So like layering too many things on top of that seems unnecessary at this point. So
there's time. Yeah. Hopefully there's time for all of it.
There's time. There's time for all of it, for sure. Yeah. I do have another question about the scores, and I'm just wondering if the scores are also kind of emergent, or if they keep morphing, or whether you have scores that you like are more like a manual or a guide or a formula that you don't change because there are so many factors that are changing. Is that something you are thinking about right now in the process, or have you decided on what the scores are?
Well, the scores are still emerging. Our primary scores are pretty clear, and we have absolutely lots of sub-scores for that each of us individually are thinking about and attending to that are absolutely changing, and there's room for those to change. But in terms of the main activities that we're doing, they're pretty consistent. And we're just at day 5 of our rehearsal period, so there's definitely room for things to shift and move around. But yeah, so far we definitely have favorites and things that feel good to do and to kind of explore within. So yeah,
they feel like the inevitable parts of a process to me always. When you find that there's something that is always happening, it's like it cannot be ignored. It has to be like, the more it's like that becomes a practice in itself. To practice those scores in that same way becomes kind of a practice in itself. I mean, that is
absolutely.
Yeah, that's the dance.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, it's I'll be there several times because I'm really intrigued. I love fashion, and then I would want to revisit for the bodily experience of revisitation, like what it means to go back to something that I think I know and not see anything that I thought those kinds of, that excites me, and you don't get to do it very often, especially not with dance or movement performances.
Yeah.
Maybe with a theatre show that it might last a month, but dance performances tend to be here for 3 days and gone, unless you can go visit them in the rehearsal process or follow them on tour. But otherwise, that's it. You get a one-time viewing, 2 if you're lucky. So this is I would encourage people to go more than once because you can.
Yeah, I truly hope that folks do, and it's really I'm really glad to be able to offer this show for free. And it is kind of the nature of this longer durational work, and to invite folks to come back as much as they want, to make it as accessible for people to do that as possible.
Yeah. Are you able to do that through funding and make it?
Yeah, and the Dance Center has been really generous in offering that. So yeah, this show is being presented in the context of the Push Festival as well. So that will also bring in, Push runs just from January 18th to February 4th. So just for the second 2 weeks of the show. So this work kind of expands beyond the boundaries of that. But
yeah, that's great. Yeah, so you have the Dance Center for the duration, and then the Push Festival is like come on board for that part of it, which will also bring a different interdisciplinary crowd, which is also really wonderful, really great. Yeah, lovely. So listeners can look out for it in both those ways, Dance Center and Push, and in those promotions. Thank you. That's wonderful. I feel like the way you talked has more process in it.
I mean, we
also get to but that we get to hear about, right? We don't get to hear unless we follow fashion. I follow some fashion people and some insider, fashion blogs, and unless you go inside, you won't know this. You won't get this information necessarily immediately.
For sure. Yeah.
Or think of it as fashion design, like the first thing. And I feel the same way in dance. Actually, I feel exactly the same way as you. That there's something about being able to point people in a direction. It just has that sense of expanding people's perception of what fashion design is, or what choreography is, or what dance making is. Those kinds of things. So I really appreciate you sharing that on the spot.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to think about it. Yeah,
it's great. It's wonderful. Okay, well, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. It's given us such a great insight into your process, and also kind of what to expect as audience members as we engage with the work. And it's quite different, I think, for the Dance Center to be offering something like this as a residency setup in this way. So thank you for bringing that project to the Dance Center too. And as fashion and like clothing and the body and sound and film and all of those things in dance are, of course, we're used to all of these collaborative environments, but being able to have, shopping come into it, I think is really great. And the premise just being, like I said, such a conceptual premise that everybody is tied to, I think is just also really quite refreshing. So it's wonderful. It's great. So I hope it all goes well. I know it's going well.
Yeah, well,
wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me and for asking such great questions.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to seeing you around the Dance Center and for seeing your event. Thank you for opening the doors to us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening. We would love for you to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts, as this will help other listeners find us and help us to grow our dance audience. We'll be back next month. In the meantime, you can follow us on Facebook at The Dance Center, Twitter at Dance Center, and Instagram at The Dance Center BC. And if you'd like to support our work, please consider making a donation. Just go to our website at thedancecenter.ca, where you'll find extensive information about our upcoming programs and events. The music for the Dance Center podcast was composed by James B. Maxwell. Always a pleasure to connect with you through dance. Until next time.